Good morning, Eisenberg kiddos. This is your math lesson for April 20th. Make sure that you have opened up the document called Points, Lines, Line Segments, and Rays, because that's what we're going to be using for our lesson today. So you actually will not need your math book at all today. So if you went ahead and got that out, you won't need it. But I would keep your notebook out in front of you in case you want to take any notes. Obviously, you can keep this document pulled up to use when you go to do your independent assignments, but sometimes it helps me to actually write things down. It helps my brain remember it and understand it a little better, so you might want to do that if that helps you. Okay. All right. So today we're going to be talking about some more geometric figures and some ways to label the parts of these figures. Okay. I'm going to start up here at the top where it gives you kind of an introduction to what we're going to be learning today. So it says line segments, rays, and points can be helpful when describing angles and two-dimensional figures. So that's saying this is how we can describe some of these shapes that we've been working with over the last week or so. A point marks an exact position, and we represent a point with a dot. So I'm going to stop here for just a second. So if you think about a point, it's an exact spot in space. That's why we use a dot to represent a point, because it's just really one exact spot in space. So think of it as if I told you guys to line up at the door and you were standing in line, the place where your feet are standing in the line is a point in space. We could draw a little circle around your foot or around both of your feet, and that would be your spot in space. So that's what a point represents, is just a spot in space, and that's why we use a dot. So now let's talk about the next one. We're going to read right here. It says a straight path connecting a set of points that goes on forever in opposite directions is called a line. Okay, so imagine the person in the very front of our line and then the person in the very back of our line. They are in two different spots in space. Okay, so they would each be a point. And then every person in between them is a line, because we make a straight path from the front to the back. Now remember that whenever we see a figure that has arrows in math, that means that technically we can stretch that figure, that line, forever and ever in both directions. Okay? So what that means is, technically, if we didn't have walls around us, our line could stretch forever and ever towards the front, and it could stretch forever and ever towards the back if we wanted to. And that's exactly what the arrows on a line mean, is that you could technically stretch that line forever and ever in both directions. Okay, that's very important to remember. That makes it different than, I'm going to kind of skip down. That makes it different than a ray, because remember, a ray stretches forever and ever, but only in one direction, because that ray has an end point at the back, and then it extends in the opposite direction. It has that arrow on the other side. Okay, so lines can go in both directions forever and ever, but a ray can only stretch in one direction forever and ever. So think about it. We talk about the rays of the sun shining out. The sun doesn't shine back on itself. Its rays only shine out onto other things. So a ray only shines in one direction. Okay. And then the last one that we haven't talked about yet is a line segment. And a line segment is the section of a line in between 2 points. So if you think about how we line up at our door, we have the person in the front, that's one point, and we have the person at the very back, that's another point. All of the students in between would be the line segment. So it's sort of like you take a chunk of the line and pull it out by itself, the section that's in between the 2 points of the line. Okay. All right. So let's go through some examples. Example 1 says, Nick drew the figure shown. So here's his figure. Identify the figure he drew. So I see that we have a point here, and another point here. And I noticed that they've labeled those points X and point Y. So they've actually given these points a name. That's what these letters stand for, is to give an actual name for that point. So this is point X, this is point Y, and then they've connected them with a straight path. And I noticed there's an arrow on this side and an arrow on this side. So that means it will stretch in both directions. So the figure extends in both directions. The arrows show that it extends without ending, so it will never stop. That means it is a line. So Nick drew the answer right here would be line. He drew a line, and we know that because it goes in both directions and it's straight. This little box is just another, it's the same definitions that were in the introduction paragraph, but then it gives you pictures to help you as well. Okay, so that's something you might want to look at when you're doing your independent work. We're going to go ahead to example 2. Example 2 says, describe the path should say, of sunshine as a line or a ray. Well, I just talked to you about this. So if this is the sun, right, and it starts here and it only shines this way, the sun cannot shine back on itself. It only shines outward, right? So it has an end point here. The sun is the end point, and it's shining forever and ever and ever in one direction. Notice the arrow at the bottom. So if it says the path of light begins at the sun and extends without ending. So the path of light is what did we say it was? Do you remember? It's a ray. Okay, that's why we call it a ray of sunshine. All right, we have a few more practice ones here. So a dot marking a location in space would be a what? It would be a point. Okay, look at number 2. I have to scroll down. Number 2, I noticed that both sides have an end point. So there's no arrows. This cannot extend in either direction. It can't go this way. It's stopped by this endpoint. It can't go this way because it's stopped by this endpoint. So what would we call this figure if it's just the space in between these points? It would be a line. I'm going to underline it. Line segment, because it's only the space in between the 2 points. Okay, so the biggest way to help me to remember the difference between a line segment and a line as far as the way they look is the line segment has these endpoints that stop it instead of having the arrows that show that it extends forever. Okay, so let's look at number 3. Number 3, I notice a straight path, and I notice that both sides have arrows, which means it can extend forever in both directions. So what would we call this figure? Okay, this figure is just called a line. It can extend in both directions. All right, number 4. I notice in this figure that we have an end point on this side, but it can stretch forever and ever in one direction. So here's the arrow showing we can stretch it forever this way, but it stops on this side. That reminds me of the sun, and the sun shines using what? A ray. All right, now, sometimes we might have a shape, and now we can use these words to describe a shape. Okay, so if this is Paul's shape, it says describe the figure Paul drew, then label its parts. So here's the first box. That's why it says box 1 down here. Look where it's pointing. What do we call this little dot? In math, we can't call it a dot. It's called a point. Okay, and then box 2 is pointing to the section of the path in between this endpoint and this endpoint. So if it stops here and stops here, that means it can't stretch at all in either direction. Do you remember what we call the path that you can't stretch in either direction? It's just one little piece of the path. We call it a line segment. All right, so these answers will stay here for you to look at. I would keep this pulled up so that you have all this vocabulary and these examples in front of you, and you can go ahead and complete your Edge Elastic assignment. Be sure to push submit when you're done. That's the only way I can see or grade your answers, okay? All right, I will talk to you guys later.